Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of BackBeat, the behind-the-scenes look at Newsbeat, our unconventional podcast challenging conventional wisdom. My name is Mike Conforti, aka Manny Faces, the producer of Newsbeat, and once again we're here with our look at the episode. This one is called Exonerated and Broke, a really deep, moving episode. We hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't heard it yet and you're listening to this first, stop, rewind, and go check out the episode.
I think they could just stop. I don't think they have to actually rewind.
They have to press the rewind button on their cassette recorder. As always, I'm joined here in the studio with the editor-in-chief of Newsbeat, Mr. Christopher Twarowski.
What up, Manny?
And the managing editor of Newsbeat, Mr. Rashed Mian.
Yo.
So yeah, a really interesting episode. I learned a lot, as always. I'm sure the listeners did as well, and I'm sure you guys did, as we all always do, putting the episode together. Let's talk about it. Let's give a little bit of insight and background and context to some of the stuff. It's a big topic, and I think it requires a little bit of extra digging in.
Yeah, so in this episode, we dissect the widely held belief that once an innocent person is cleared and exonerated, that they're immediately awarded compensation for all that time they spent rotting away behind bars. This is not the case. And, helping us to understand this on the episode is Rebecca Brown over at the Innocence Project, which uses DNA to clear people wrongfully convicted. We spoke with New York Times reporter Emily Bazelon and, of course, Alan Newton, who spent more than 2 decades in prison for crimes he didn't commit before being exonerated by DNA evidence in 2006. I don't know how you guys feel. I mean, we talked a little bit about it the other day, but for me, I think this is possibly our darkest episode yet. And I think what makes it so dark is that it's so real and a very real prospect that this can happen to anybody.
Yeah, and I wish our listeners could, sort of meet Alan, just get a sense of the kind of person he is and who he's become since he's been exonerated. And as you learned from the episode, he was convicted for a rape, an assault, and a robbery that happened in the Bronx, even though he did not commit the crime. And, he's just an affable guy he's very welcoming. And you get a sense right away that he's not the kind of guy who can commit a heinous rape. But to that point, he did mention how this can happen to anybody. It could happen to, a police officer. It could happen to anybody in the street. So I think that's the fear that maybe some people have. I mean, you don't think about it walking down the street that you're going to be wrongfully convicted or something. But, this guy one day was just sitting at home on a hot summer day.
Right.
With his family, and then the cops came knocking on his door. He had no clue, and they took him away, and from that point on, he was locked up.
So maybe we'll dig a little deeper into Alan's story. This gives people a little bit more insight as some of the stuff that we couldn't get into the episode, although a lot of it had to do with his specific ordeal.
Yeah, because I think what we wanted to do was touch, as horrific a topic as exonerations are and being wrongfully convicted, it's a subject that's been covered a lot, thankfully.
Right.
But the idea of the compensation, so the next step, as Rebecca Brown mentions in the episode, that, the day you're exonerated, there's a big celebration, your family, your friends are there.
The press, the media.
Other exoneration groups that helped you along the way, your lawyers. But then once you take those next steps over the course of days, weeks, and months, there's no one has been in that predicament that could tell you what you're supposed to do next. Life is hard as it is for normal people, but for a person like in Alan's situation who spent 21 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, he was locked up since 1986 in jail.
Right.
He doesn't know what a cell phone is when he's coming out. There's little things like that we take for granted.
Sure.
So Alan, obviously, as you learned in the episode, was wrongfully convicted and he fought to get his innocence. What we couldn't tell you was the sort of the fight, the struggle that he had every day in prison, in terms of trying to get himself exonerated. Which
he says, when you're in jail for a crime you didn't commit, he says, all you can do is spend time trying to prove your innocence. And in his case, he filed motions and he was trying to learn. He was in the law library. He was trying to figure out what he could do.
Yeah, so what else do you do in your prison? And you're someone who's just adamant that they didn't commit a crime.
Right. Yeah.
They're going to research and do what they can to try to get freed.
And he couldn't get DNA testing in the beginning.
Right. So in the United States, DNA testing was first introduced in courts in 1986. The first case that actually happened was in Florida, involving a rapist, and it was DNA that the authorities used to eventually convict the guy. Okay, but it wasn't a nationwide thing. So Alan is convicted in New York State, and it wasn't until 1994 when the New York State Court of Appeals, the highest court in the land in New York State, actually deemed DNA evidence admissible in court. So that happened in August 1994. Alan hears about this 3 months later, literally in October 1994. He files his first motion to get exonerated based on DNA evidence. He wanted that DNA tested.
Right.
And, so we'll stop for a second. This is a guy who's toiling in prison now for basically about 10 years, a decade. He knows he's innocent. And now he has this moment where, wow, there's DNA evidence. Maybe I now actually have a chance to get exonerated.
Right.
Only to find out while he's petitioning the courts that the rape kit that was used to examine and to gather evidence in the case, the woman who was raped, was apparently missing, according to the authorities. They couldn't find the rape kit. So Alan is petitioning. He learns that he can't find it. Eventually, it takes 10 years for the authorities to actually find the rape kit. And it wasn't at the medical examiners where it was technically supposed to be. It was in a warehouse in Queens. And this only happened because he had the help of the Innocence Project and the Bronx District Attorney's Office. So this is 2006 now.
Wow.
Where he has a team to help him to get exonerated.
Right.
So the DNA was tested, and Alan was eventually ruled out as an assailant because the DNA didn't match his. He was exonerated on July 6, 2006, after 21 years in prison. Maybe Chris could talk about this because this is probably the most personal thing that we got out of Alan was when he talked about the ride home from prison. So he's in Western New York.
Right. And it's not even an immediate ride home. It's, It's buses to, I guess, lower security prisons and being transferred, coming downstate in stages.
Right.
I mean, imagine that. I mean, first of all, I think it's impossible for anyone who hasn't lived this to fully understand what we called on the episode, the daily torturous hell that the wrongfully convicted go through. In Alan's case, we're talking about a rape. We're talking about sexual crimes, which adds an entire other level of torture to being inside, because I'm sure, a lot of listeners probably have, it's probably known or thought or sort of like street knowledge that if you're a rapist or you're a child molester, there's a hierarchy in prison, and some prisoners and COs will use that information to coerce, to threaten, to punish, to, maim, potentially to kill. I mean, this is, and Alan confided in us and told us in the interview, one of the only ways he's still alive is because he told everybody he was a robber, which was, one of the crimes he, was wrongfully convicted for. When he learned of his exoneration, he was put on a bus, and, he describes the experience as an out-of-body experience. He was still shackled to other inmates. And, one thing that Rashed and I know from covering some of these stories is the bus is actually typically used as a punishment for inmates. So in hindsight, I was thinking about it. So here's Alan on this bus. He finds out he's exonerated. And the bus among inmates is known as a place where, forever bus ride. They'll put you on a bus. They'll send you to another prison that's on the other side of the state. They get there. Oh, the paper's on here. Oh, you got to go back to this one. And the bus ride, now, you're shackled and there's no bathroom.
Right.
So the fact that, he's describing this bus ride now on his road to freedom.
You still got to go through it.
Yeah.
It's crazy. You still got to go through that experience, even though not only do you know that you're innocent, not only have they said now that you're innocent, but they still get that one last
right, because he actually had to go to court, So
like
it wasn't like, a document appeared
and
then
you walk out of the jail.
Alan Newton, inmate, whatever number is released because he's proven innocent. He still had to go to court to get the final notice of exoneration. Alan brings this up a lot. He talked about DNA a lot with us, and I don't think you can overstate the importance of DNA. It's interesting because when you go back to when DNA was first deemed admissible in New York State, it was actually law enforcement that was actually cheering this decision. They're like, wow, we now have a new tool to convict people. Because
right.
maybe, you're missing some evidence. You're maybe missing that weapon that was used in a crime if it was a homicide. And the thing that you only have might be like a strain of hair or some type of blood that was found.
Right.
So, but in Alan's case, he was able to take advantage of DNA to help clear himself.
Right.
So that rape kit, the one that for basically 10 years he was told was missing, that rape kit is basically Alan Newton's holy grail. That was the key to everything, the key to his freedom, the key to his second life. And it's not something that, we heard it from him, but it's not something we appreciate it and we can recognize it. But unless you live it, you can't understand what that's like. To know that something that can be the key to your freedom is out of reach. So this DNA evidence, and that's why the Innocence Project, I think, is so important. And I thought it was great that they allowed us into their Manhattan office to talk to them, because they're really doing God's work over there.
No, they're doing good work.
It's absolutely amazing.
It's noble work. And it's not an uncommon thing. So can we talk about how often people get wrongly convicted?
Yeah, so I believe Rebecca Brown had said, the estimate is somewhere around up to 5%. But in truth, who the hell really knows?
Right.
There's over 2 million people in prisons in the United States. So
even that,
even if it's 1 to 5%, that's, even one person, one person in jail or in prison for something they didn't do is a crime.
Right. Now, exoneration is one saving grace, to this, because there are exonerations. There's a lot of them, happening when they can get the DNA, even though, as Rebecca Brown stated, it's often a struggle. And as Alan's case proved, it's not always so simple to just get the DNA and exonerate someone, but it happens. And there's a number of exonerations that have been based on DNA evidence, more so, I guess, recently as they push for these things.
Yeah, I mean, it can't be overstated. Just to get to the level exoneration,
right?
You've been ripped away, from your friends, family, and loved ones. There are all of these forces outside that's designed to keep you in there.
And to your point about the exonerations, it's great that it's happening. But, so when you think about the numbers, in 2014, 2015, 2016, they've all been record years for exonerations, all over, I believe, 150 each year.
Yeah, 2014, 147, 162 in 2015, 168 in 2016. So
so it's a good thing.
Talking about hundreds and hundreds of people. I have here, it says 2,700 people have been exonerated since 1989, but those people lost on average nearly 9 years of their life, on average.
Right. And I think those numbers are from the National Registry of Exonerations, which is sort of like a coalition of 3 universities teaming together. And I think the total number, which is unbelievable, when you count up the total of years that everybody since 1989 has spent behind bars for a crime they didn't commit, was over 15,000 years.
Jeez.
Just think about it, 15,000 years combined.
I'm looking at the stats, and you noted here, 2015, now this is crazy, also set a record for the most exonerations for crimes that didn't even occur.
It's 75 people in prison for crimes that
never even happened. Now,
terrifying is that?
There's wrongful. We know that some of the reasons for wrongful convictions, as Alan talked about, a lot of them involve misidentification. There's official misconduct. There's false confessions, or whether you're kind of coerced to confess to a crime. Matter of fact, as you heard in the episode, because there's some states that deny the compensation based on whether you've admitted to the crime or not. For instance, New Jersey, but 10% of their clients
plead guilty
to a crime they didn't commit. Just to put an exclamation point on the years lost, we heard the story of Glen Ford, which is a heartbreaking story, where this man lost 30 years, or almost 30 years he was in jail.
You could technically say he lost his life because he was wrongfully convicted.
Got out, was exonerated, freed, and then months later.
Right. So this is Glen Ford, who Emily Bazelon, the great staff writer for the New York Times Magazine, and she's also 1/3 of the Slate Political Gabfest. Shout out to the Gabfest.
All right. Podcast on podcast love.
The crazy thing about that case is Glen Ford, as horrible as Alan's case is, see, this is where it's hard to even compare these cases, but as hard as it is to think about what Alan went through, Glen Ford was on death row. This was a guy who was convicted of a murder.
Solitary confinement,
a murder he didn't do. And when I said that he died because of his wrongful conviction, Glen Ford actually developed lung cancer while he was in prison, and it went untreated. So he gets out of prison, and he's actually fighting for compensation. And in Louisiana made it hard because they have a provision, which we're going to talk about, just the obstacles to compensation. They had a provision that basically made it difficult for him to get compensation. So he took his fight for compensation to the grave after he died from complications of the lung cancer that he became afflicted with while in prison.
Yeah. No, it's a tragic situation, like you said, a miscarriage of justice, because it's, in a lot of cases, first of all, the exonerations could be sped up. We've heard that, a number of instances where there's just so much red tape, and district attorneys are not always willing to go digging, and really because, it kind of makes sense in a twisted way. They don't want to admit that they were wrong. They don't want to, open up other lawsuits and have to pay out for more people, right?
And just to that point, and sort of the battle to even get to exoneration, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention a story that we as journalists have been covering for roughly about 10 years, and that's the plight of a man by the name of Ronald Bauer, who did over 20 years in prison. The crimes that he supposedly went away for continued while he was in prison. It's believed it was actually a New York City police officer who was committing those crimes, and actually had the chairman of the New York State Attorney General's Office Conviction Review Bureau write a letter to the parole board stating, I don't have it in front of me right now, but to the effect of Ronald Bauer likely did not commit these crimes. And so because of the letter, he's freed, but he's not exonerated. So here we have somebody in this bizarre limbo where they're out, but they're the highest level of sexual predator on the books.
Has to be registered, the whole deal.
And to your point, with the political sort of machinations that go on, and all the obstacles that have to become overcome just to obtain exoneration, what happens after that letter's written to the parole board? Well, the chairman is out of a job. He was crushed. His career was destroyed for
doing what he's supposed to be doing. Right?
So if that doesn't, sort of exemplify some of the obstacles that people just to get to the exoneration level. Again, thank God in Alan's case, DNA.
Right, and in Alan's case.
And almost not, because it wasn't found for 10 years.
It wasn't found. Right,
It
wasn't found. In Alan's case, he was luckily awarded compensation through New York City. But again, so I think it's important to talk about the statute. So as we lay out in the episode, 18 states in the United States still don't have compensation statutes.
So no rules determining what
nothing
compensation should be. It's up to whatever you got to sue.
Well, not even. You could go that route.
Right.
But there's no legal framework that'll sort of put you on that path to get there.
Right.
So you could, in a state, say like Arizona, which doesn't have a compensation statute, you're released on an exoneration, which has happened.
Right.
And you really don't have an avenue to get compensated for the times that you missed. In Alan's case, he got convicted in the state of New York, which their compensation statute, it's sort of broad in the sense that you're required to sue. So basically, if you don't have a competent lawyer, someone with the means to help defend you, to gather evidence. Look, trials are expensive. They cost a lot of money.
As Alan says, with the resources to go up against the state when the state has unlimited resources.
Exactly.
And they're not trying to give this money up.
So you're in prison for X amount of years. You're not working. All your friends have moved on. Your family, who knows, have some of them passed away, maybe, if you're in there long enough. And you come out and there's zero compensation.
Yeah, and so Alan is still fighting New York State, actually. So he was awarded money in the city, from the city, New York City. But
the state is
his case. The state is pending. There's been some complications. He was, I believe, awarded money, and then there was an appeal done by the state. So that money is just sitting there. He hasn't been able to obtain that.
And this has already been years.
Yeah, it's been years.
This has already been years.
So he's been out of prison right now for 11 years. And nobody, but like I said, and he admits it, he's one of the lucky ones. So he uses his platform as a man who's been through the process, so he's been incarcerated for something he didn't commit, and he's been through the process of compensation. So he actually takes this knowledge and he advocates for other exonerees. He wants them to know that they have someone who they could look up to, who could help support them, in this trying time. Alan, he talked about you not even, in some cases, you don't even have an ID. You leave the courtroom and you leave without an ID.
Right.
He said in his case, he went to the DMV and he had to bring a copy of a Daily News article about his exoneration. So these are the things that, like, the little things that we all take for granted.
Right.
And, obviously, we're not going to think about these things throughout our day. But, we all have trying days. But when you think about what these people are going through,
for sure.
It's pretty hard to compare.
Now, some states are better, I guess, than others. I found it interesting that there is such a disparity between New York State, which one would normally think of as, hey, liberal, democratic, we're here, we'll do the right thing. And they're like, yeah, no, you got to, come at us. Come at me, bro. But some states, interestingly enough, Texas.
So Texas is considered, as Rebecca Brown told us, Texas is considered to have the, quote, gold standard compensation statute. And you got to think about it. This is Texas, a conservative state, not only a conservative state, but it imprisons the most people in the country. But it also has had the most exonerations in the country, which, if you think about the percentage of the people in there, that sort of might make sense. But they're it's good that they're getting people out who shouldn't be there. So in Texas's case, you're awarded $80,000 once you have your compensation approved. And not only that, you have an equal annuity to the time that you spent behind bars. So as Rebecca explains it, if you spent 10 years for something you didn't do, you get a matching $80,000. So you multiply that, that's $800,000 on top of the $80,000 you're going to get,
right?
Which I think we all seems fair for some, someone that obviously hasn't been working. And then you take a state like New York, as we mentioned, that you actually have to go through the process of getting a lawyer, as we mentioned, get someone who can actually pay for these for the time to go up against the state. Or you also have a place like Wisconsin that they'll give you $5,000 a year according to their compensation statute, but that's capped at $20,000. Okay, and so to put it in perspective, the minimum wage in Wisconsin is about, over the course of a year, if you're a minimum wage worker, you're earning $15,000. So you're getting, over the course of once you reach that $20,000,
right, you're
only making $5,000 more than a person who is on minimum wage.
Wow!
And you haven't been working, you haven't been doing anything to make to contribute to society.
Right.
So those are the comparisons that a lot of exoneration advocates like to make.
Right.
The federal government has its own statute, which I believe is $50,000 for people who are exonerated. Rebecca of the Innocence Project basically says so. That's sort of like the baseline that they think is appropriate.
Right.
Obviously, they'd always want more, for these people.
Sure.
But as I said, Wisconsin is only 5,000. So all the disparity, as you mentioned, in these laws across the country is sort of unbelievable.
Well, I mean, we talk so much about all the kind of backstory and context of some of the information we shared during the episode. We normally like to get into the making of. Obviously, we had these interviews, was great. Musically, of course, we wanted to have sort of something that really set the tone. I think the way we put it together, I think was did justice.
And as a producer, do you want to talk about the unique way in which we started this episode? Because this is different than from the other episodes that our listeners are accustomed to.
Yeah, well, we're trying to mix it up with the intros, man. But this process we went through really lent itself to what you heard in the beginning of the episode. And we wanted to immediately let people know that this was about exoneration. So we had media clips from several exonerations just to let you know that this is a thing. This happens, frequently enough that you've heard of it, you know about it. But then, of course, Chris, man, in the interview with Alan, you asked that one pivotal question that just stopped us cold, and as you can hear, stopped him cold as well. And it was extremely emotional and really, got to the heart of the issue of what this sort of ordeal can do to just a regular everyday person.
That for me brought it home, because you can look at the numbers, you can look at the stats, and they're beyond mind-blowing and staggering. Anybody wrongfully convicted who spends a second behind bars for something they didn't do is beyond a tragedy. To be there with him and for him to, I think everybody in the room
totally unexpected. He was composed the whole time, and then obviously if you didn't listen to the episode, you don't know what we're talking about. But again, stop.
Yeah, what are you doing? You should have listened to this already. Yeah,
but yeah, that question Chris asked, it sort of was like a gut punch, unfortunately, to for Alan, because he sort of broke down.
Yeah, it gets past all the stats and the different statutes and rules, and it just gets back to that human element and why we wanted to tell this story, that it's bad enough to be convicted, spend time in prison for something you didn't do. To be freed is great. To get money compensated for it, as he did. And this is a guy who was compensated to a great degree, so far, still trying to get what he rightly deserves. But it doesn't take away that pain. It doesn't take away those memories, and it doesn't take away that ordeal.
No amount of money,
right,
will bring that time back.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's one of those cases where no matter your politics, if you're standing in a room with somebody who's been through this, you can't help but understand.
Yeah, and this is sort of can happen to anyone. It does happen to anyone across racial lines, across all demographics, male, female, white, black. People get arrested, convicted, spend time in prison for crimes they didn't commit, and hopefully in the end get exonerated and have to deal with these issues and compensation issues and all that across the board.
And one last final note on that. Remember, and I think this gets lost a lot, for everybody who's exonerated, there's a perpetrator out there.
It's true.
Somebody committed that crime.
Right.
It wasn't this guy, but you know what? Somebody did.
Right. And I'm going to amplify what Alan said to this point. He says, this is why it makes so little sense for the prosecutors and the district attorneys and the organizations that could be exonerating people and make it difficult, could be compensating, letting them get out, not making it so hard to fight for DNA evidence or open up cases again. He said, this is a public safety issue. He says, this is there's somebody out there that wasn't put in jail for this heinous crime. And you would think that this would be the impetus needed for law enforcement agencies, for district attorneys to do the right thing and not make it so difficult. And the compensation isn't just to give money to someone who deserves it. This is now someone that he says once you're compensated, you can kind of move on with your life. You don't have to tie up the court's resources. You don't have to tie up the law enforcement to try to push these things, get these things going. It should be a fair process. It shouldn't take years and years and years and years to the point where you may die before you get what you deserve.
Like Glen Ford. And he mentioned, to your point, that not only does he speak to other exonerees, he's welcome to speak to law enforcement about this because, at the end of the day, this makes your job better. Right. You want to get the guy or woman who committed the crime. And in the case of the victim who Alan was accused of raping, there was nobody was ever found after Alan was exonerated.
Yeah. Well, listen, guys, amazing work just putting this together. I hope that the listeners learned from this episode as we did, putting it together. It's another thing to become aware of and to perhaps if you're in a position where you can advocate for these sorts of issues. Great respect for the Innocence Project.
Donate.
Yeah. Support them.
Check them out. Support them.
If this issue in this episode touched you in some way, they're the ones that are really leading the charge, I think, for these kind of battles, fighting hard. They've helped exonerate hundreds of people that, were just, these aren't bad people that they're, getting off. These aren't defense lawyers. I mean, who might get someone off who has done a crime. I mean, these are people that have been proven unequivocally, DNA evidence that they're not the perpetrator. And so big shout outs to the Innocence Project. Thanks to Emily Bazelon for bringing these stories to light on the mass media scale. And our great respect and love for Alan Newton for sharing his story with us and with you. And of course to, as he frequently does, Silent Night for contributing his amazing insight and perspective to this episode with original lyrics that were that really put an exclamation point on this episode. So once again, this is BackBeat, the behind-the-scenes look at Newsbeat, our unconventional podcast challenging conventional wisdom. We will be back with new episodes, new backbeats, and all that good stuff. Follow us on social media. We're on Twitter at US Newsbeat. We're on Instagram at US Newsbeat. We're on Facebook as US Newsbeat. And please, 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 obviously, subscribe, share, rate, tell your friends, tell your enemies. Tell your neighbors, tell your ex-girlfriends and ex-boyfriends. Just tell everyone about it. Obviously, as you know, if you're still listening to us.
No one that we owe money to, though.
No. Don't let anyone know.
Actually.
Don't let Sally Mae. Don't tell Sally. You can reach out if you'd like. Email us if you have any questions about the podcast, want to suggest future topics, give us some tips. We'll take them, and we'll do the very best we can to bring those issues to light. Newsbeat at MoreyPublishing.com. MOREY publishing.com. Once again, this is Mike Conforti, a.k.a. Manny Faces, Chris Twarowski, Rashed Mian, the whole Newsbeat crew. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back next time.
Newsbeat is produced and distributed by MP Studios, a division of Morey Publishing. The producer of Newsbeat is Michael Conforti. The editor-in-chief of Newsbeat is Christopher Twarowski. The managing editor of Newsbeat is Rashed Mian. The executive producer of Newsbeat is Jed Morey. Show notes are available on usnewsbeat.com. Subscribe today on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you download your favorite podcasts.